The thunderous roar of the locomotive's wheels against the rails was the last sound Gabriella Lancaster heard before her world turned upside down. One moment, she was gazing out the window at the rolling plains of Wyoming Territory, and the next, metal screamed against metal as the Pacific Express lurched violently off the tracks, sending passengers tumbling like rag dolls through the air. It was May 15, 1878, and what should have been a routine journey from Denver to Alta, Wyoming Territory, had just become a fight for survival. Gabriella had been traveling alone, as she often did in her work as a journalist for the Denver Chronicle. At 26 years old, she had built a reputation for herself writing about the changing West, documenting the railroad's expansion and the lives of those affected by it. The irony wasn't lost on her now as she lay pinned beneath twisted metal. The same railroad that had been her career's focus might well become her tomb. Her consciousness faded in and out. Blood trickled down her forehead, and the sickening scent of coal smoke mixed with something else, something burning. Through a small gap in the crumpled metal wall of the passenger car, she could see flames beginning to lick at the wooden debris scattered across the prairie. The car she was trapped in had rolled completely onto its side, coming to rest at the bottom of a shallow ravine. "Help!" she called out, her voice weak even to her own ears. "Somebody, please! I'm trapped in here." Pain shot through her left leg whenever she tried to move it. It was pinned beneath a heavy metal beam that had once been part of the roof supports. Around her, she could hear moans and cries from other passengers, but they seemed distant, coming from other parts of the wreckage. Closer, more immediate, was the crackling sound of fire and the hissing of steam from the overturned locomotive ahead. Miles away, Elijah Nash pulled back on the reins of his chestnut mare, listening. The distant sound that had caught his attention came again, a deep, resonant boom that didn't belong among the natural sounds of the Wyoming prairie. At 30 years old, Nash had spent enough time in these parts to recognize trouble when he heard it. Standing in his stirrups, he scanned the horizon. A plume of dark smoke rose in the distance, maybe 3 miles east, near the railroad tracks. Without hesitation, he spurred his horse forward, the animal responding instantly to his command. Nash was returning from a 2-week job driving a small herd of cattle to a ranch outside of Cheyenne. The pay had been good, but not enough to keep him from feeling that familiar restlessness. 8 years as a cowboy had taught him to appreciate the open country, but lately he'd been wondering if it was time to put down roots somewhere. These thoughts vanished as he crested a low rise and saw the full extent of the disaster spread out before him. The Pacific Express lay in ruins, scattered across the prairie like discarded toys. The locomotive and tender were on their sides, still connected but jackknifed at an impossible angle. Behind them, 3 passenger cars and 2 freight cars had derailed, some completely overturned. Smoke billowed from multiple points in the wreckage. People were already moving among the debris. Those passengers who had escaped injury or only suffered minor wounds were helping others. But Nash could see that the situation was dire. Without thinking twice, he urged his horse down the slope toward the scene of devastation. Tying his mare to a section of unbroken fence near the tracks, Nash sprinted toward the nearest overturned car. Several men were already working to free passengers trapped inside, using tools they'd salvaged from one of the freight cars. "Where do you need help?" Nash called out to a man who appeared to be organizing the rescue efforts. "Check the forward passenger car," the man replied, pointing to a crumpled metal carriage lying at the bottom of the ravine. "We haven't been able to get to it yet, and there's fire spreading that way." Nash nodded and took off running. As he approached the ravine, he could see flames beginning to catch at the dry prairie grass surrounding the wreckage. The wooden parts of the car wouldn't last long once that fire reached them. Sliding down the embankment, he circled the overturned carriage, looking for a way in. Inside the mangled car, Gabriella fought to stay conscious. The smoke was getting thicker, making it harder to breathe. She had managed to free her right arm and was now trying to shift the beam that pinned her left leg, but it wouldn't budge. "Hello? Is anyone alive in there?" A deep voice called from outside. "Yes, I'm here," Gabriella shouted back, her voice cracking. "I'm trapped. Please help me." Nash pressed his face close to a narrow gap in the twisted metal. "I hear you, madam. How bad are you hurt?" "My leg is pinned." "I can't move it," Gabriella answered, coughing as smoke swirled around her. "There's a fire coming, isn't there? I can smell it." "Don't worry about that right now," Nash replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "I'm going to get you out." Looking around frantically for something to use as a tool, Nash spotted a leather satchel lying in the grass nearby. He grabbed it, finding it contained a set of surveyor's tools including a small hatchet. It wouldn't be enough. Running back to his horse, he retrieved his own tools, a larger axe, and the heavy knife he carried on his belt. By the time he returned, flames had begun to lick at the dry grass just 20 yards from the car. There wasn't much time. Looking through the gap again, he could just make out Gabriella's face in the shadows, pale, streaked with blood, but determined. "Madam, I'm going to have to cut through this metal to get to you. Is there anyone else alive in there with you?" Gabriella glanced around as best she could. "I don't know. I heard voices earlier, but not anymore." Nash examined the wreckage. The door was completely inaccessible, crushed against the ground. The windows were either shattered or bent out of shape. His only option was to cut through the weakest part of the carriage wall, a section where the metal had already been partially torn in the crash. "Stand back as far as you can," he called to her, then swung the axe at the twisted metal. The impact jarred his arms, but the axe blade made a small dent. Again and again he struck, each blow weakening the metal further. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes, but he didn't stop. The heat from the approaching fire was growing more intense. Inside, Gabriella pressed herself as far away from the weakening section as her trapped leg would allow. Each strike of the axe sent shudders through the carriage. Metal groaned and screamed as it gave way inch by inch. Finally, Nash had created an opening large enough for him to reach through. Gabriella could see his face now tanned and weathered, with intense blue eyes focused entirely on his task. He was using his knife now, sawing through a stubborn strip of metal that wouldn't yield to the axe. "Almost there," he grunted, sweat dripping from his brow. "Just hold on." The metal finally gave way, creating an opening barely large enough for a person to squeeze through. Nash reached in, his hand extended toward Gabriella. "Take my hand," he urged. "Let me see if I can pull you free." Gabriella stretched out her arm, her fingers just brushing his. "I can't reach. My leg is still trapped." Nash pushed himself further into the opening, ignoring the sharp edges of metal that tore at his shirt and scraped his skin. Their hands finally met, his large, calloused palm enveloping her smaller one. "I've got you," he said, his voice softening. "I'm not letting go." Their eyes met through the smoke and shadows, a moment of connection amid chaos. Then Nash looked past her to see what was trapping her leg. "That beam is too heavy for me to lift alone," he said. "I need to make this opening bigger so I can get in there with you." He reluctantly let go of her hand and returned to his work, attacking the metal with renewed urgency. The fire was now less than 10 yards away, and the heat was becoming unbearable. With a final effort, Nash tore away enough metal to create an opening he could crawl through. Without hesitation, he squeezed into the carriage, the jagged edges slicing his forearm as he passed. Inside, the air was thick with smoke. Nash quickly moved to Gabriella's side, assessing her injuries. Her left leg was pinned beneath a heavy metal beam, and blood had soaked through the fabric of her skirt. "The beam's too heavy to lift straight up," he said, "but if I can find something to use as a lever." His eyes fell on a length of metal that had once been part of a luggage rack. It looked sturdy enough. He wrenched it free and wedged it under the beam. "When I lift this," he told Gabriella, "you need to pull your leg out immediately. Can you do that?" She nodded, her face pale but determined. "I'm ready." Nash threw his weight onto the makeshift lever. The beam groaned and lifted slightly. Gabriella gritted her teeth against the pain and pulled her injured leg free. As soon as she was clear, Nash let the beam drop back into place. Outside, the fire had reached the edge of the carriage. Smoke poured in through the opening Nash had created. "We need to go now," he said, quickly examining her leg. It was badly bruised and possibly broken, but there was no time for a proper assessment. "Can you move at all?" "I'll try," Gabriella said, attempting to stand. Her leg buckled immediately and she cried out in pain. Without hesitation, Nash scooped her into his arms. "Hold on tight." He carried her to the opening and carefully maneuvered her through, trying to protect her from the jagged edges. Then he followed, emerging into air that was hot but clearer than inside the carriage. The fire was spreading rapidly now, feeding on the dry prairie grass. Nash carried Gabriella up the ravine, away from the wreckage and the advancing flames. Only when they reached the relative safety of the trackside did he set her down gently on a patch of unburned grass. "Thank you," Gabriella said, looking up at her rescuer properly for the first time. His face was streaked with soot, his blue shirt torn and bloodied from the sharp metal, but his eyes held a steadiness that calmed her racing heart. "Elijah Nash," he said, offering her a small smile. "Though most folks just call me Nash." "Gabriella Lancaster," she replied, wincing as she shifted her injured leg. "I owe you my life, Mr. Nash." Before he could respond, shouts came from further down the tracks. More rescuers had arrived, bringing wagons from the nearest settlement. Nash flagged them down, and soon Gabriella was being tended to by a woman with rudimentary medical knowledge. "The leg's not broken," the woman announced after a careful examination. "Badly bruised and sprained, but the bones are intact. You're a lucky woman, Miss Lancaster." "Luck," Gabriella thought, glancing at Nash, who stood nearby, watching over her with concern. "No, not luck at all. Something else entirely." As night fell, the survivors of the Pacific Express were gathered in the small town of Rockwell, 10 miles east of Alta. The town's hotel, saloon, and several private homes had opened their doors to accommodate the injured and displaced passengers. Gabriella found herself in a small but clean room above the general store, her injured leg bandaged and elevated on a pillow. A knock at the door roused her from a light doze. "Come in," she called. The door opened to reveal Nash, cleaned up but still wearing his torn shirt. He carried a tray with a steaming bowl of stew and a cup of coffee. "Thought you might be hungry," he said, setting the tray down beside her bed. "The telegraph lines are down, but they're sending riders to Alta and Cheyenne. Help should arrive by morning." "Thank you," Gabriella said, suddenly aware of how hungry she was. Not just for the food, for everything. Nash shrugged, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Anyone would have done the same. But they didn't. You did." She studied him as she took a spoonful of stew. "What brings you to these parts, Mr. Nash?" "Just finished a cattle drive near Cheyenne," he replied, taking a seat in the room's only chair. "Was on my way back to Alta when I heard the explosion." "Alta?" Gabriella's eyes widened. "That's where I was heading. I'm writing a series of articles about the railroad's expansion for the Denver Chronicle." Nash raised an eyebrow. A woman journalist, that's not something you see every day. No, it isn't, she agreed with a small smile. But the world is changing, Mr. Nash. Women are doing all sorts of things these days that might surprise you. I don't doubt it, Miss Lancaster, he said, returning her smile. And after seeing you keep your wits about you trapped in that wreckage, I'd say you're more than capable of whatever you set your mind to. They talked as she ate, discovering they had both grown up in Missouri before making their separate ways west. She to pursue journalism in Denver, he to follow the life of a cowboy after the war. The easy conversation surprised them both, a moment of normalcy amid the aftermath of disaster. When Gabriella had finished eating, Nash stood to leave. You should rest. Doctor says we can move the less seriously injured to Alta tomorrow if the relief train arrives. Will you be continuing on to Alta as well? She asked, trying to keep her tone casual. Nash paused at the door. I reckon so. I've got a friend there who might have worked for me. He hesitated, then added, besides, someone ought to make sure you get settled properly. I'd like that, Gabriella said softly. Nash nodded, a faint smile playing at his lips. Good night, Miss Lancaster. Good night, Mr. Nash. After he left, Gabriella lay back against her pillows, thinking of the moment his hand had reached through the twisted metal to grasp hers. It was a strange thing, she reflected, how disaster could forge connections that might never have existed in the normal course of events. The relief train from Cheyenne arrived the next morning, bringing doctors, supplies, and news. The derailment, they learned, had been caused by a washed-out section of track following heavy rains. 17 passengers had died in the crash or its immediate aftermath, with dozens more injured. Gabriella, notepad in hand despite her own injuries, interviewed survivors and rescuers alike. Nash watched her work with growing admiration. She moved among the injured with a gentle authority, coaxing their stories from them with genuine empathy, then transformed their halting words into flowing narratives in her neat handwriting. You're good at that, he commented as he helped her aboard the relief train bound for Alta later that day. People want to tell their stories, she replied, settling into a seat with her injured legs stretched out before her. Sometimes they just need someone to listen properly. Nash sat beside her, his tall frame awkward in the confined space. And what about your story? Will that be in your article too? Gabriella looked down at her bandaged leg. Parts of it, though I'm not sure I can properly describe what it felt like to be trapped in that car, knowing the fire was coming closer, and then seeing your hand break through the metal. Probably best to leave that part out anyway, Nash said with a self-deprecating smile. Wouldn't want folks thinking I'm some kind of hero. But you are, she said seriously, meeting his gaze. At least to me. The train journey to Alta took just over an hour. Gabriella spent much of it making notes for her article, while Nash gazed out the window at the passing landscape. Occasionally their eyes would meet, and a smile would pass between them, a shared acknowledgement of the unusual circumstances that had brought them together. Alta, when they arrived, was a bustling town of around 2,000 souls, its prosperity tied to the railroad that had reached it 5 years earlier. The station platform was crowded with townspeople eager to help the survivors of the crash. Miss Lancaster. A portly man in a bowler hat pushed through the crowd, waving a telegram. Nash tensed instinctively, positioning himself between the approaching stranger and Gabriella. It's all right, she assured him. That's Henry Simmons, the editor of the Alta Gazette. I telegraphed him from Denver about my visit. Simmons reached them, out of breath and visibly relieved to see Gabriella alive. When we heard about the derailment, I feared the worst. Your editor in Denver has been frantic for news. As you can see, I'm somewhat worse for wear but still in one piece, Gabriella replied, gesturing to her bandaged leg. "Thanks in large part to Mr. Nash here." Simmons turned to Nash, eyeing him with newfound interest. "Then the town of Alta owes you a debt of gratitude, sir." Miss Lancaster's series on the railroad is highly anticipated. Nash shifted uncomfortably under the editor's scrutiny. "Just happened to be in the right place." "Well, we've arranged accommodations for Miss Lancaster at Mrs. Pemberton's boarding house," Simmons continued. "It's the finest in town, very respectable and equipped to handle her injury." "That's very kind," Gabriella said, "but I'm afraid I'll need help getting there." "I can take her," Nash offered immediately, "if someone could point us in the right direction." Simmons looked between them, clearly noting Nash's protective stance beside Gabriella. "Of course. It's 3 blocks north on Pine Street, white house with blue shutters. I'll have your luggage sent over, Miss Lancaster, though I understand most of it was lost in the crash." "Most of it," Gabriella confirmed, "but thankfully not my notes or camera." With Simmons's help, they secured a wagon for the short journey to the boarding house. Nash lifted Gabriella carefully onto the bench seat, then took the reins. As they pulled away from the station, she glanced at him. "You don't have to stay with me, you know. I'm sure you have your own affairs to attend to." Nash kept his eyes on the road. "I said I'd see you settled, and I mean to keep my word." There was something in his tone that suggested more than simple obligation, and Gabriella felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. Mrs. Pemberton's boarding house was indeed the finest in Alta, a 2-story white clapboard building with a wide porch and meticulously maintained garden. The proprietress herself came out to greet them, a tall, angular woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. "Miss Lancaster, we're so relieved to see you safe," she said, surveying Gabriella's injury with a practiced eye. "I've prepared the corner room on the ground floor so you won't have to manage stairs." "Thank you," Gabriella said gratefully. "This is Mr. Nash. He saved my life during the derailment." Mrs. Pemberton's expression softened as she looked at Nash. "Then you're welcome in my house any time, Mr. Nash. Will you be staying in Alta long?" "Not sure yet, madam," Nash replied. "Depends on what work I can find." "Well, if you need lodging, Jacob Turner over on Elm Street rents rooms to single men of good character," she said, giving him an appraising look. "Now, let's get Miss Lancaster inside and comfortable." Nash carried Gabriella into the house, following Mrs. Pemberton to a pleasant room at the back overlooking a small kitchen garden. He set her gently on the bed, suddenly aware of their proximity and the intimacy of the moment. Their eyes met briefly before he stepped back. "I should go," he said, hat in hand. "Let you rest. Will I see you again?" Gabriella asked, unable to keep the question from escaping. Nash nodded, a half-smile lifting one corner of his mouth. "I reckon you will, Miss Lancaster. Alta's not that big a town." "Gabriella," she said. "After what we've been through, I think you can call me Gabriella." "Gabriella," he repeated as if testing the feel of her name. "Then I'm Elijah or Nash, whichever you prefer." "Nash," she decided. "It suits you." With a tip of his hat, he left, leaving Gabriella with the strange feeling that despite her injury and the trauma of the crash, something unexpectedly good had entered her life. Over the next week, Gabriella settled into a routine in Alta. Her leg was healing well, and though she still needed a cane to walk, she was able to conduct interviews and explore the town for her articles. Each day, Nash would appear at some point, sometimes bringing her a book from the town's small library, other times just stopping by to see how she was faring. On her 4th day in town, he arrived at the boarding house with a beautiful wooden cane. "Thought this might be more fitting than that broomstick Mrs. Pemberton loaned you," he said, presenting it to her on the porch where she was enjoying the morning sun. Gabriella ran her fingers over the smooth wood, admiring the craftsmanship. "Did you make this?" Nash shook his head. "Friend of mine did. Thomas Gray, the blacksmith. I'm helping him at the forge while he's short-handed." "It's beautiful," she said, testing the cane. It was perfectly sized for her, the grip fitting her hand as if made for it. "Thank you, Nash." He shrugged, but she could tell he was pleased by her reaction. "Thought we might take a walk if you're up to it. Show you some of Alta that you might not find on your own." They walked slowly along Alta's main street, Nash patiently matching his long stride to Gabriella's careful pace. He pointed out buildings and shared stories about the town's early days that she eagerly noted for her articles. "How do you know so much about Alta?" she asked as they paused to rest on a bench outside the mercantile. "I thought you were just passing through." Nash looked down the street, his expression thoughtful. "I spent a winter here 3 years back when work was scarce. Thomas took me in, taught me some smithing. It's not my primary trade, but it's good to have skills to fall back on when cattle work is lean." "And yet you didn't stay," Gabriella observed. "No," he admitted. "Got restless, I suppose. Always been that way, moving from place to place, job to job." "And now," she asked, watching his profile. He turned to meet her gaze. "Now I'm not so sure that's what I want anymore." The moment was interrupted by the arrival of Henry Simmons, bustling down the sidewalk with a stack of newspapers under his arm. "Miss Lancaster, Mr. Nash," he called. "Hot off the press, your first article about the derailment." He handed Gabriella a copy of the Alta Gazette. There on the front page was her byline, "Pacific Express Disaster. A Survivor's Account by Gabriella Lancaster." Beneath it was an artist's rendering of the derailed train, surprisingly accurate given that it must have been drawn based solely on her description. "It's already been wired to Denver," Simmons said proudly. "They'll be publishing it in tomorrow's Chronicle." Gabriella scanned the article, her own words now transformed into print. "It looks wonderful, Henry. Thank you for rushing it through." "Folks can't get enough news about the crash," Simmons replied. "Your perspective as a passenger trapped inside makes it all the more compelling." Nash took the paper when she offered it, reading silently. Gabriella watched his face, curious about his reaction to her portrayal of the disaster and his role in her rescue. "You made me sound better than I am," he said finally, handing the paper back. "I wrote exactly what happened," she countered. "If anything, I understated your courage." Simmons looked between them with interest. "Well, I must get these distributed. Miss Lancaster, when you're ready with the next installment, bring it by the office." After the editor left, Nash and Gabriella continued their walk, ending up at a small cafe where they shared coffee and apple pie. "Do you mind being in my articles?" she asked as they ate. "I can keep your name out of future pieces if you prefer." Nash considered this. "I don't mind," he said eventually, "though it's strange to see myself through someone else's eyes." "How would you describe yourself then?" Gabriella asked, genuinely curious. He laughed softly. "Not with fancy words like yours, that's certain." He paused, thoughtful. "Just a man trying to make his way, I suppose. Never thought of myself as anything special." "Well, you are to me," she said simply. Their eyes met across the table, and something shifted between them, an acknowledgement of deepening feelings neither was quite ready to name. As the days passed, Nash became a fixture in Gabriella's daily life. He would finish his work at the forge by mid-afternoon, wash away the soot and sweat, and seek her out sometimes at Mrs. Pemberton's, sometimes at the Gazette office where she often worked, and occasionally at the cafe that had become their favorite meeting place. 2 weeks after her arrival in Alta, Gabriella's leg had healed enough that she no longer needed the cane for short distances. To celebrate, Nash suggested they ride out to see the sunset from Sandstone Ridge, a local landmark just outside town. "I don't know if I'm ready for horseback riding," Gabriella said doubtfully. "We'll take Thomas's wagon," Nash assured her. "Smooth ride and plenty of room for a picnic supper." The evening was perfect, warm with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of sage and wildflowers. Nash drove them along a well-maintained road that wound gradually up to the ridge. Gabriella watched him as he handled the horses with easy confidence, his profile strong against the golden light of the setting sun. At the top of the ridge, Nash helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. He spread a blanket on a flat rock overlooking the valley, then unpacked the picnic. Mrs. Pemberton had prepared fried chicken, cornbread, pickles, and berry pie. They ate as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Alta lay below them, its buildings miniaturized by distance, the railroad tracks cutting a straight line through the landscape. "It's beautiful," Gabriella said softly. "In all my travels, I've never seen a sunset quite like this." "It's one of the reasons I keep coming back to Wyoming," Nash admitted. "Something about this land gets under your skin. I can see why." She turned to study his face, gilded by the fading light. "Where will you go when you leave here?" Nash was quiet for a long moment. "I've been thinking about that," he said finally. "Thomas has offered me a partnership in the forge, says he's getting too old to handle all the work alone, especially with the railroad bringing more business." "And," Gabriella prompted when he fell silent. "And I'm considering it," he said, meeting her gaze. "Never thought I'd want to settle in one place, but lately I've been seeing things differently." The way he looked at her left little doubt about what or who had changed his perspective. "My assignment in Alta was only supposed to last a month," Gabriella said, her heart beating faster. "I'm due back in Denver next week." "I know," Nash said quietly. "Will you go?" It was the question she'd been asking herself for days. Her editor at the Chronicle was expecting her return, had already planned her next series of articles. Her life was in Denver, her small apartment, her friends, her career. "I don't know," she admitted. "My work is important to me." "Of course it is," Nash said quickly. "I wouldn't ask you to give that up." "What are you asking, Nash?" Gabriella held her breath, waiting. He reached out, taking her hand in his. "I'm asking if there might be room in your life for more than just your work, for Alta, for—" He hesitated, then finished simply, "for me." Gabriella looked down at their joined hands, his large and work-roughened, her smaller but no less capable. "When I was trapped in that train car," she said slowly, "watching the fire coming closer, I thought about all the things I hadn't done yet. All the stories I hadn't written, places I hadn't seen." She raised her eyes to his. "But since then, I've been thinking about other things I might be missing: a home, a family, love." Nash's hand tightened around hers. "Gabriella, I can write from anywhere," she continued. "The Gazette needs a proper reporter. Henry said so himself. And Denver isn't so far that I couldn't visit occasionally, submit special pieces to the Chronicle." Hope dawned in Nash's eyes. "Are you saying you might stay?" "I'm saying I want to," she answered honestly. "If there's someone worth staying for." Nash moved closer, his free hand coming up to gently cup her cheek. "There is," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "There's me, Gabriella, and I'm falling in love with you." The simple declaration, spoken against the backdrop of the fading sunset, brought tears to her eyes. "I think I started falling the moment your hand broke through that metal wall," she whispered. When his lips met hers, Gabriella knew with absolute certainty that she had found something in Alta far more valuable than any story she had found, a future she never expected, with a man who had literally torn through barriers to reach her. The kiss deepened, Nash's arms wrapping around her as if he never intended to let go. When they finally parted, breathless and smiling, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. "Stay," Nash said simply. "Stay in Alta. Stay with me." Gabriella nodded, her decision made. "I will." The next morning, Gabriella sent a telegram to her editor in Denver, requesting a permanent reassignment to cover Wyoming territory from Alta. While waiting for a reply, she threw herself into her work, expanding her articles about the derailment into a series examining railway safety and the impact of train disasters on frontier communities. Nash continued working at the forge, now with the certainty that he was building not just a business but a future. The town noticed the change in him. The restless cowboy who had drifted through years earlier was now a man with purpose, his eyes lighting up whenever a certain lady journalist entered the room. 3 days after their evening on the ridge, Gabriella received a response from Denver. She was sitting in the Gazette office, reviewing proofs with Henry Simmons when the telegraph operator's boy delivered the message. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Nash, who had come to walk her to lunch, watched her face anxiously. "Well?" he prompted when she lowered the paper, her expression unreadable. A slow smile spread across her face. "They've agreed. I'm to be the Chronicle's Wyoming correspondent based in Alta, with the understanding that I'll travel as needed to cover major stories across the territory." Nash's face broke into a grin of relief and joy. "That's wonderful news." Henry Simmons beamed at them both. "And the Gazette will be proud to publish your local pieces, Miss Lancaster. In fact, I've been meaning to discuss a more formal arrangement with you." "What kind of arrangement?" Gabriella asked, intrigued. "I'm not getting any younger," Simmons said, patting his ample midsection. "Been thinking about cutting back my hours, maybe taking some time to visit my daughter in St. Louis. The Gazette could use a managing editor who knows the newspaper business." Gabriella stared at him in surprise. "Are you offering me a position? Consider it a proposal," Simmons replied with a twinkle in his eye. "We can discuss the details later. For now, I believe Mr. Nash is waiting to take you to lunch." Outside in the clear Wyoming sunshine, Gabriella told Nash about Simmons's unexpected offer. "Managing editor," Nash said, clearly impressed. "That's quite an opportunity." "It is," she agreed, taking his arm as they walked toward the cafe. "It would mean more responsibility but also more stability. A permanent place in Alta." Nash stopped walking, turning to face her. "Is that what you want, permanence?" "With the right person," she said, her meaning clear. "What about you? Is Thomas's partnership offer still appealing?" "More than ever," Nash replied, reaching for her hand. "Especially knowing you'll be here too." 2 months later, as summer reached its peak in Wyoming territory, Gabriella stood in the small garden behind Mrs. Pemberton's boarding house. She wore a simple cream-colored dress, adorned with lace at the collar and cuffs, the finest Alta's dressmaker could produce on short notice. In her hands, she held a bouquet of wildflowers gathered that morning from the prairie. Henry Simmons stood beside her, having agreed to give her away in the absence of her father, who had passed years earlier. From the back porch, Mrs. Pemberton watched with proud tears in her eyes, as if sending off her own daughter. Across the garden, beneath an arch twined with late summer roses, Nash waited with the minister. Thomas Gray stood at his side as best man, his usually sooty blacksmith's apron replaced by a respectable suit for the occasion. Nash's eyes never left Gabriella as she walked toward him, his expression a mixture of wonder and devotion that made her heart swell. When she reached him, he took her hand as naturally as if they'd been doing so all their lives. "Dearly beloved," the minister began, his voice carrying clearly in the still afternoon air, "we are gathered here today to join Elijah Nash and Gabriella Lancaster in holy matrimony." The ceremony was brief, but heartfelt. When they exchanged vows, Nash's voice was steady and sure, while Gabriella's trembled slightly with emotion. The small gathering of friends and townspeople, including many whom Gabriella had interviewed for her articles, watched with approval as the couple sealed their union with a kiss. The celebration afterward was held at the Alta Hotel, where the proprietor had cleared the dining room for dancing. Thomas Gray's wife played the piano while local musicians accompanied with fiddle and guitar. Nash and Gabriella opened the dancing, moving together with the easy coordination of two people perfectly attuned to each other. "Happy, Mrs. Nash," he murmured as they circled the floor. "Very," she replied, savoring the new name. "Though professionally, I'll still be writing as Gabriella Lancaster. As long as you come home to me as Gabriella Nash, I don't mind what name appears in print," he said, pulling her closer than was strictly proper for a public dance. Later, as the celebration continued around them, they slipped away to the hotel's balcony for a moment alone. The stars were emerging in the darkening sky, reminiscent of that evening on Sandstone Ridge when they had declared their feelings. "I have something for you," Nash said, reaching into his pocket. He withdrew a small object that gleamed in the lamplight spilling through the windows. "I made it myself at the forge." He opened his palm to reveal a delicate silver pendant in the shape of a key. "Thomas helped with the finer details," he admitted, "but the design is mine." "It's beautiful," Gabriella said, touching it gently with her fingertip. "A key," Nash nodded, his expression serious. "From the first moment I reached through that metal wall and took your hand, you've been unlocking parts of me I didn't know existed. Parts that wanted a home, roots, a life shared with someone." Gabriella felt tears welling in her eyes as he fastened the pendant around her neck. The silver was cool against her skin, but quickly warmed. "I love you, Elijah Nash," she said, using his full name for one of the few times since they'd met. "Thank you for cutting through more than just metal to reach me." He drew her close, his arms strong and secure around her. "Thank you for giving me a reason to stop wandering." They returned to the celebration hand in hand, moving among friends and well-wishers with the contentment of two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed. That night, they rode by moonlight to their new home, a small but sturdy cabin on the edge of town that Nash had been renovating in secret during the weeks leading up to their wedding. Inside, Gabriella discovered a surprise. A corner of the main room had been transformed into a writing desk, complete with shelves for her reference books and a large window providing natural light. "Your own space," Nash explained, watching her reaction carefully. "For your work." The thoughtfulness of the gesture moved her deeply. "It's perfect," she said, running her hands over the smooth wood of the desk. "How did you know exactly what I needed?" "I pay attention," he said simply, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "That's what love is, isn't it? Seeing what matters to the other person and making it matter to you too." Gabriella turned in his arms, reaching up to touch his face. "You're a wise man, Elijah Nash." "Only about some things," he replied with a smile, before lifting her into his arms and carrying her to their bedroom. In the weeks that followed, they settled into married life with surprisingly little adjustment. Nash worked at the forge with Thomas, gradually taking on more responsibility as the older man began to step back. Gabriella divided her time between the Gazette office, where she was learning the business side of newspaper production from Henry Simmons, and her writing desk at home, where she crafted articles for both local and Denver readers. Their evenings were spent together, sometimes with friends at the hotel dining room or cafe, but more often at home, where they would share the events of their day over dinner before retiring to sit by the fire. Nash would clean his tools or carve wood, while Gabriella read aloud from new books ordered from Denver or worked on her latest article. It was a simple life, but deeply satisfying to them both. Nash found that his restless urge to move on had been replaced by an equally strong desire to build something lasting in Alta. Gabriella discovered that having roots in one place didn't diminish her ability to tell important stories. In fact, understanding the community more deeply enhanced her writing. Their first Christmas as a married couple brought a heavy snowfall that blanketed Alta in white. Nash had closed the forge for the holiday, and Gabriella had submitted her articles early, leaving them with rare, uninterrupted time together. On Christmas Eve, they sat before the fire after dinner, watching the flames dance. Nash had his arm around Gabriella, who was unusually quiet. "Something on your mind?" he asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. She hesitated, then took his hand and placed it gently on her abdomen. "I'm not entirely sure yet," she said softly, "but I think there might be someone else joining us next Christmas." Nash went very still, his eyes wide as he processed her words. "A baby," he whispered, his voice filled with wonder. Gabriella nodded, watching his face anxiously. "The doctor says it's early days yet, but all signs point to a child arriving next summer." The joy that spread across Nash's features was answer enough, but he pulled her close and kissed her with such tenderness that tears sprang to her eyes. "A family," he said when they parted, his hand still resting protectively over the place where their child grew. "Our family, Gabriella." "Are you happy?" she asked, needing to hear the words. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," he assured her, his voice rough with emotion. "I never knew I could want something so much until you told me just now." They sat in the firelight, making plans and dreaming of the future, a future neither could have imagined on that fateful day when a train derailed, and a desperate cowboy cut through metal to reach a trapped woman's hand. As the months passed, Gabriella's condition became apparent. To her relief, both Henry Simmons at the Gazette and her editor in Denver were supportive of her continuing to work throughout her pregnancy. She modified her schedule somewhat, avoiding the longer reporting trips into the territory, but maintained her presence in Alta as a respected journalist. Nash proved to be an attentive and protective husband, though Gabriella occasionally had to remind him that pregnancy wasn't an illness. He channeled his energy into preparing their home for the baby, crafting a beautiful wooden cradle and adding a nursery to the cabin with Thomas's help. In late July 1879, just over a year after the derailment that had brought them together, Gabriella went into labor during a summer thunderstorm that reminded them both of the sound that had preceded the train crash. Nash stayed by her side throughout the long night, holding her hand and whispering encouragement as she brought their child into the world. With the first light of dawn, their son was born, a healthy boy with Nash's blue eyes and a dusting of dark hair. They named him Samuel Thomas Nash, honoring both Gabriella's father and the friend who had helped bring them together. As Gabriella held their son for the first time, Nash sat beside them on the bed, his arm around his wife, his expression one of absolute awe. "He's perfect," he whispered, gently touching the baby's tiny hand with one finger. Samuel instinctively grasped it, his small fingers barely reaching around Nash's much larger one. "He has your hands," Gabriella observed with a tired smile. Strong like his father, Nash kissed her forehead. "And hopefully his mother's intelligence and determination." Mrs. Pemberton, who had assisted the midwife during the birth, quietly left the room to give the new family privacy. Through the open window, they could hear the town of Alta beginning to stir, the distant whistle of the morning train, the clang of Thomas opening the forge, the calling of merchants setting up their stalls in the market square. "I never thought I'd have this," Nash admitted, watching his son's peaceful face. A wife, a child, a home. For so long I convinced myself I wasn't meant for such things. What changed? Gabriella asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. Nash met her gaze, his eyes full of love. I heard an explosion, found a derailed train, and cut through metal to find the other half of my heart trapped inside. Gabriella reached up to touch the silver key pendant she still wore daily. The best stories never end the way we expect when they begin, she said softly. Outside their window, Alta continued its daily routines. Inside, a new family embraced their shared future, bound by love that had been forged in crisis but would endure through all the ordinary days to come. As Samuel grew from infant to toddler, the Nash family established themselves as fixtures in Alta. Nash's partnership with Thomas Gray flourished, eventually leading to him taking over the forge entirely when Thomas retired. Gabriella continued her work at the Gazette, gradually assuming more of Henry Simmons's responsibilities while maintaining her correspondence for the Denver Chronicle. Their home expanded along with their family. By Samuel's third birthday, he had a sister, Elizabeth Rose, named for Nash's mother. The children grew up surrounded by stories those Gabriella wrote for publication, and those Nash told by the fireside about his years as a cowboy, and the fateful day he had rescued their mother from a burning train. On the 5th anniversary of the derailment, Gabriella published a special piece in both the Gazette and the Chronicle, revisiting the disaster and its aftermath. She interviewed survivors, many of whom had stayed in touch over the years, and reflected on how a single event could alter the course of so many lives. Some might call it fate, she wrote in the closing paragraph, that a lone cowboy happened to hear the explosion and reach the wreckage before the fire consumed it. Others would name it providence or simply good fortune. Whatever forces brought rescuer and rescued together that day, the connection forged in those desperate moments proved stronger than the metal that had to be cut through to establish it. From disaster came deliverance, and from deliverance, a love that continues to unfold in ways neither could have imagined as they reached for each other's hands amid the twisted wreckage of the Pacific Express. Nash read the piece with their children on his lap, his voice steady until the final lines when emotion made it rough. Samuel, now old enough to understand some of the story, looked at his father with wide eyes. "You really cut through a train to save Mama?" he asked, impressed. "I did," Nash confirmed, "and it was the best thing I ever did." Elizabeth, too young to fully comprehend, nevertheless patted her father's cheek. "Brave Papa," she declared, making them all laugh. That night, after the children were asleep, Nash and Gabriella stood on the porch of their home, looking out at the stars over Alta. The town had grown in the 5 years since they'd made it their home, but it still maintained its character, a place where railroad and frontier met, where past and future converged. "Any regrets?" Nash asked, his arm around his wife's waist. "About staying in Alta, I mean." Gabriella shook her head. "Not one. My stories reach more readers now than they did when I was in Denver. And the other parts of my life, you, the children, our home, those are beyond anything I could have hoped for. Even with a blacksmith for a husband," he teased. "Not exactly the sophisticated company a writer might prefer." She turned to face him, her expression serious despite his light tone. "You are exactly the man I need, Elijah Nash. Strong enough to cut through metal when necessary, but gentle enough to raise our children with love. Brave enough to run toward danger, but wise enough to know when you've found a place worth staying." He pulled her close, still marveling after 5 years at how perfectly she fit in his arms. "I love you, Gabriella, more today than yesterday and less than I will tomorrow." As they sealed this declaration with a kiss, The evening train whistled in the distance, right on schedule, a reminder of how their story had begun, and of the journey that continued to unfold before them, one day at a time, in the town that had become their home. Years passed, and Alta grew from frontier town to established city. The Nash family grew too. Samuel and Elizabeth were joined by a younger brother, William, born in 1885. The children inherited their parents' best qualities. Samuel showed Nash's quiet strength and mechanical aptitude. Elizabeth displayed Gabriella's keen intelligence and gift for words. And young William combined his father's adventurous spirit with his mother's compassion. By 1893, 15 years after the derailment that had brought them together, Nash and Gabriella had become respected elders in the community. Nash's forge had expanded into a successful metalworking business that employed several men, including Samuel, now a young man of 14 who showed remarkable talent for the craft. Gabriella had taken over the Gazette entirely when Henry Simmons retired, transforming it into one of the most respected newspapers in Wyoming, which had become a state 3 years earlier. They still lived in the same house, though it had been expanded several times over the years. The writing desk where Gabriella had penned her early articles remained in its place of honor, though she now had a proper office at the Gazette. Nash had preserved the original cabin within the larger structure, wanting to maintain that connection to their beginnings. On the 15th anniversary of the crash, they hosted a gathering at their home for the survivors who still lived in the area. It had become a tradition over the years, a celebration of life continuing despite tragedy, of connections formed in the aftermath of disaster. As evening fell and guests departed, Nash found Gabriella sitting alone on the porch swing, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the cooling air. He joined her, the swing creaking slightly under his weight. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, taking her hand. Though they had both aged silver threading through her dark hair, lines etched more deeply around his eyes, the simple touch still carried the same comfort and connection it always had. "I was thinking about time," she replied, leaning against his shoulder. "How quickly it passes, and yet how some moments seem to stretch and hold the weight of an entire lifetime. Like the moment I cut through that train wall and saw your face," Nash said, understanding immediately. Gabriella nodded. 15 years ago today. Sometimes it feels like yesterday. And sometimes it feels like I've known you forever," he added softly. They sat in companionable silence, watching the stars emerge. From inside the house came the sounds of their children, Elizabeth practicing piano, the boys engaged in some good-natured argument over a game of checkers. "I've been thinking," Nash said eventually. "Samuel's nearly ready to take on more responsibility at the forge, and William and Elizabeth are growing so fast." "What are you suggesting?" Gabriella asked, turning to see his expression. "Maybe it's time for us to take that trip we've always talked about," he replied. "See some of those places you've written about but never visited. San Francisco, perhaps, or even New York." Gabriella's eyes widened. In all their years together, Nash had rarely expressed interest in traveling far from Alta. The town and its surroundings had been enough for him, or so she had thought. "Are you serious?" she asked. "You've always been happiest staying in one place." "I've been happiest with you," he corrected gently. "And I've seen how your eyes light up when you receive those letters from your colleagues in the big cities, or when you read about new places in your magazines." He squeezed her hand. "You've given me 15 years in Alta. Maybe it's time I expanded my horizons a bit, the way you did when you agreed to stay here." Tears welled in Gabriella's eyes at this unexpected gift. "I would love to travel with you," she said. "But what about the children, the Gazette, your business?" The children are old enough for a bit of independence, with Mrs. Pemberton looking in on them, Nash reasoned. Samuel can manage basic work at the forge with Thomas's son overseeing him, and you've trained your assistant editor well enough that the Gazette could survive without you for a month or two. The more they discussed it, the more possible it seemed. By the time they went inside to check on the children, they had the beginnings of a grand tour of the eastern United States the following spring, once the winter's harsh weather had passed. The announcement was met with varying reactions from their children. Samuel was quietly proud to be trusted with responsibilities at the forge. Elizabeth was excited by the prospect of having material for her own writing, which showed considerable promise. William, at 8 years old, was dismayed until Nash promised to bring him a genuine baseball from New York City. As they prepared for bed that night, Gabriella watched Nash's familiar routine, hanging his clothes neatly, washing at the basin, checking the locks on the doors as he had every night since they'd married. These small, ordinary moments had become the framework of their life together, as important in their way as the dramatic beginnings of their relationship. "Thank you," she said as he joined her in bed. "For what?" he asked, pulling her close in the darkness. "For still surprising me after 15 years, she replied. "For knowing what I need sometimes before I know it myself." Nash's chuckle rumbled in his chest beneath her ear. "I'm just trying to keep up with you, Mrs. Nash. You've been surprising me since the day we met." The Eastern journey, the following spring, was everything they had hoped for and more. They traveled by train somewhat nervously at first, given their history, but the Transcontinental Railroad had improved considerably in safety since 1878. They visited Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, and Boston, staying in fine hotels and seeing the sights Gabriella had read about for years. Nash, to his own surprise, enjoyed the trip immensely. The bustle of New York intimidated him at first, but he found unexpected pleasure in the museums and theaters Gabriella insisted they visit. For her part, she delighted in seeing these cities through his fresh perspective, his observations often more insightful than those of the guidebooks they carried. They returned to Alta renewed, carrying trunks of gifts for the children and memories they would treasure. The town welcomed them back warmly, having followed their journey through the regular dispatches Gabriella had sent to the Gazette. Life settled back into its comfortable rhythms, but with subtle differences. Nash, inspired by techniques he'd seen in Eastern workshops, introduced new methods at his forge. Gabriella's writing took on broader themes, informed by her expanded worldview. Their home filled with books and souvenirs from their travels, and discussions about future journeys became regular features of family dinners. As their children grew into adulthood, Nash and Gabriella watched with pride as each found their own path. Samuel eventually took over the family business, marrying the daughter of a local rancher and building a home nearby. Elizabeth pursued her love of writing, attending college in Denver, the first woman in Alta to do so, before returning to work alongside her mother at the Gazette. William, the most adventurous of the three, joined the army as a young man, seeing parts of the world his parents had only read about. Through it all, Nash and Gabriella remained each other's constant. The hand reached through disaster. The connection that had transformed both their lives in ways neither could have imagined on that fateful day in 1878. In 1903, 25 years after the derailment, they celebrated their silver anniversary with a grand party attended by most of Alta. By then, they were grandparents 3 times over, with Samuel's 2 sons and Elizabeth's daughter bringing new joy to their lives. The celebration included the unveiling of a special edition of the Gazette. featuring a reprint of Gabriella's original article about the crash, alongside a new piece reflecting on a quarter-century of life afterward. Nash, never entirely comfortable with public attention, nevertheless stood proudly beside his wife as she read excerpts to the assembled crowd. "The hand that reached through twisted metal that day," she read from the conclusion, "has held mine through joy and sorrow, triumph and loss. It has rocked cradles, built a home, worked honestly, and reached out to others in need. If time is measured not in years but in moments that matter, then Elijah and I have lived several lifetimes together already, with more yet to come." That night, alone in their room, Nash presented Gabriella with an anniversary gift, a delicate silver bracelet to match the key pendant he had given her on their wedding day. Engraved inside were the words, "Still reaching for you." "Always," he promised as he fastened it around her wrist. They had long ago learned that love is both dramatic rescue and quiet presence, both the extraordinary moment of connection and the thousands of ordinary days that follow. Their story, begun in disaster, had unfolded into a tapestry of shared experiences, each thread strengthening the whole. And if sometimes, in dreams, Gabriella still found herself trapped in that burning train car, she would wake to find Nash beside her, his hand reaching for hers across the bed, ready as always to cut through whatever barriers separated them and bring her safely home.